When it comes to animation, a few studios immediately come to mind: DreamWorks, Pixar, Sony. But for about 20 years, there was one more name in that conversation. Yep, you know this squirrel. You've probably watched him fail to grab the same acorn for over 20 years. But chances are, you couldn't name the studio that created him: Blue Sky Studios. It was founded in 1987 from the remains of a failed company. For nearly a decade, its artists animated all kinds of commercials, even winning an Academy Award before they ever made a feature film. They later created 13 movies and grossed nearly $6 billion at the worldwide box office and built one of the best animation studios in the industry. That is, until Disney bought them. Less than 2 years later, Blue Sky was gone. About 450 employees lost their jobs, and one of animation's biggest studios disappeared almost overnight. So, how did Disney kill a $5.9 billion animation empire? To understand how the studio disappeared, we first have to go back to a time when Blue Sky wasn't even Blue Sky. The story actually begins with a company called Magi, which helped create the groundbreaking computer animation for Tron in 1982.
Ready? Ready. So long,
Okay, sure, it looks a little crunchy today, but back then, this was basically witchcraft. In fact, seeing Tron completely changed the way a young animator named John Lasseter thought about computer animation. Yes, the John Lasseter, the guy who would later co-found Pixar. Magi, however, didn't survive the decade. After the company was sold off and dissolved, a handful of its former employees decided to start over. And from its corpse in February 1987, they founded a tiny studio in New York called Blue Sky. One of those founders was an animator named Chris Wedge. Remember that name because he's gonna show up later. Unfortunately, the timing for Blue Sky couldn't have been much worse, because not too long after, the stock market crashed in 1988. Instead of making movies, Blue Sky spent the next decade doing whatever kept the lights on. They animated commercials for anyone willing to pay, including Chock-full of Nuts, M&Ms, Cheerios, and even Blockbuster. Buried among all those commercials, though, was the unlikely project that changed everything.
Braun introduces Flex Control, the first electric shaver with a pivoting head.
Believe it or not, this commercial for a brown razor won a Clio Award. The reason was surprisingly simple. People didn't realize it was animated. In fact, the Clio judges initially rejected the commercial because they thought it was filmed and not animated. Which raises a pretty obvious question. How did a tiny studio create photorealistic metal in the early 90s when most CGI still looked like it had been dipped in melted Lego? The answer was ray tracing. Instead of relying on existing technology, Blue Sky built its own rendering software that simulated how light naturally bounced off objects. It was painfully slow and incredibly expensive, so naturally, almost nobody else wanted to do it. Blue Sky, of course, took on the challenge without blinking. This was a time when ray tracing wouldn't become an industry standard for years, yet these guys were already using it to make objects look incredibly realistic. But as impressive as that was, Chris Wedge had another project he'd been quietly working on since 1990. Bunny was about a widowed rabbit baking a cake while being followed around by an annoyingly persistent moth. The short film resonated with so many people because of its message of grief, and 8 years later, it won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film. So, let's take stock of Blue Sky by the end of the 90s. They developed rendering technology years ahead of the rest of the industry. They'd won an Oscar before making a single feature film, and one of their founders had spent almost a decade creating a deeply personal short about loss because he simply believed it was worth making. That's the version of Blue Sky I want you to remember. They were commercially unglamorous and completely uninterested in taking the obvious path, which is a wonderful kind of studio to have. Sadly, it's also a very easy kind of studio for a giant corporation to own, because in 1997, 20th Century Fox came knocking. Fox already owned a visual effects company called VIFX, so instead of buying Blue Sky outright, it bought most of the studio's stock and merged the two companies. There was just one small problem. VIFX was in Southern California, while Blue Sky was in New York. According to an employee at VIFX, the two companies were never actually integrated in any meaningful way. Talk about corporate synergy. More importantly, though, 1997 marked the moment Blue Sky stopped belonging to the people who built it. There was a man in the Blue Sky now, and he was holding a spreadsheet. By 2000, the situation had only gotten worse. The visual effects industry was collapsing, and profit margins were shrinking. Studios were actually shutting down, and Fox was openly considering selling Blue Sky altogether. That's when management approached the staff with a proposal. Fox wanted employees to sell their remaining shares and stock options back to the company. In return, everyone would keep their jobs, and Blue Sky would finally get the chance to make feature films. Looking back, that sounds like an easy way to lose the last bit of control they had. But honestly, what was the alternative? So they sold. From that moment on, every major decision about Blue Sky would be made by people who didn't work there. Whether they made sequels, how many they made, and even whether the studio survived. 20 years later, when roughly 450 employees learned through a press release that Blue Sky would close in just 8 weeks, not a single one of them had a vote. That decision didn't begin in 2021. It began here, back in 2000, when ownership was traded for a promise. But to Fox's credit, they kept that promise. Blue Sky got its feature film. The only problem was that Fox had almost no faith it would succeed. In fact, they literally shut down Fox Animation Studios just days before Ice Age entered production. Way to give a confidence boost, guys. Despite the lack of faith, Blue Sky put their heart and soul into creating Ice Age. The film arrived at a time when only 9 computer-animated feature films had ever been released, including Toy Story, Shrek, and Monsters, Inc. It turned out to be an instant hit.
So if he poops, where does it go?
Who would have guessed a movie starring a grumpy mammoth, a saber-toothed tiger, and a dumb sloth taking care of a baby together would do so well? Ice Age earned $383 million on a budget of around $60 million and received an Academy Award nomination. The film instantly turned Blue Sky into a major animation studio. It was also, in some ways, an awful thing for them, because once Ice Age became a hit, Fox knew exactly what Blue Sky was for. And for the next decade, the studio lived on a schedule you could set your watch to. One Ice Age, one original movie, followed by another Ice Age repeat. To be fair, those original movies were often great, like Robots, for instance.
You missed the delivery. But it's okay. Making the baby's the fun part.
This film gave us a futuristic robot society with anti-corporate politics somehow sneaking into a family movie. Plus, the amazing Robin Williams, too. It earned $260 million and turned a profit, yet Fox never touched it again. Maybe that's a good thing. But it's definitely a pattern they repeat, because the studio gave us the Peanuts movie, one of the most faithful adaptations of Charles Schulz's work ever made. It grossed $246 million against a budget of roughly $100 million. Another success, yet another franchise Fox never revisited. Other than Rio, no other film in the studio got a sequel, because eventually, the mammoth always came back. To be fair to Fox, Ice Age paid for all of those creative risks. Every heartfelt or slightly weird project Blue Sky got to make existed because Manny, Sid, and Diego kept the whole studio going. And for a while, the strategy worked. The Meltdown earned $660 million. Dawn of the Dinosaurs climbed to $886 million, making it one of the highest grossing animated films ever released. Blue Sky had never been bigger. Unfortunately, franchises have one fatal flaw. Eventually, people notice you're making the same movie again. For instance, Continental Drift pulled off the impossible by earning $877 million despite a 37% critic score. That just shows audiences bought the ticket before the reviews had a chance to come out. But by collision course in 2016, the formula finally stopped working. Critics gave it 18%, the worst reviews Blue Sky had ever received, while the box office dropped to less than half of the previous film. So you'd understand why that was the last Ice Age the studio would ever make. Meanwhile, another company was about to decide Blue Sky's future. And that moment arrived in March 2019 when Disney bought 20th Century Fox, and with it, Blue Sky Studios. Overnight, Disney found itself owning 3 major animation studios: Walt Disney Animation, Pixar, and Blue Sky. At the time, though, almost nobody saw this as a death sentence. In fact, it looked like the exact opposite. Disney soon appointed Andrew Milstein from Disney Animation as co-president and Jim Morris from Pixar to oversee the studio while retaining Blue Sky's existing co-president. If that sounds familiar, it's because Disney had run this play before. Back in 2006, it acquired Pixar, brought its leadership into Disney Animation, and completely turned the studio around. That strategy gave us Tangled, Wreck-It Ralph, and Frozen. So the assumption in 2019 seemed perfectly reasonable. Disney was buying Blue Sky to make it better. So under new leadership in December of that year, Blue Sky released Spies in Disguise.
Look at you? I can't not look at you, Walter. I can see my butt and your face at the same time.
What really hurts is that Spies in Disguise was actually good. It earned a 77% critic score, making it Blue Sky's best reviewed film in years. This was a genuine sign that the studio had finally broken free from the Ice Age treadmill. Unfortunately, the audience didn't show up. The film earned $171 million against a budget of roughly $100 million, making it Blue Sky's weakest box office performance. Talk about awful timing. Their strongest movie in years arrived just as their new owner was deciding whether 3 animation studios were really necessary. Meanwhile, another Blue Sky project, Nimona, was slowly moving through production, and inside the studio, nobody had any reason to believe it wouldn't be the next movie they released. But on February 9th, 2021, everything came to an end. Disney announced that it was shutting down Blue Sky Studios, giving its employees an 8-week notice. After 34 years, Blue Sky would close its doors in April, leaving roughly 450 employees without a studio. Disney's explanation centered on COVID. Theme parks had closed and cruise ships weren't sailing. Given those circumstances, the studio argued that operating a 3rd feature animation studio just wasn't sustainable. And on paper, that explanation made sense. Until you realized Blue Sky disappeared, but its movies didn't. Disney kept every film, every franchise, and every piece of intellectual property the studio had created over 3 decades. The only thing it didn't keep was the people who made them. Employees were encouraged to apply for other positions within Disney, which sounds generous until you remember Blue Sky was in Connecticut by this point, and most of Disney's animation jobs were in California. The studio basically wanted them to uproot their life if they wanted a job. But the decision that hurt the most was Nimona getting canceled. The film was only about 10 months from completion. It was even set to release on January 14th, 2022. All those years of work gone in an instant. Or at least that's what everyone believed. Chris Wedge had been there from the very beginning. He co-founded Blue Sky, directed the first Ice Age, and even voiced Scrat. A few days before the shutdown, he wrote one final farewell. And with that, Blue Sky Studios officially closed its doors in April 2021. So where did it all actually go wrong? The easy version of this story is that Disney bought Blue Sky but failed to understand what made it special. But that's not entirely true, because just 9 months after shutting down the studio, Disney revealed the Ice Age Adventures of Buck Wild on Disney+. Not made by Blue Sky, of course, since it no longer existed. Instead, the movie was outsourced to another animation studio produced on a much smaller budget. It was dropped onto Disney+ with barely any fanfare, and Yeah, I can see why. Most of the original voice cast was gone, and the animation looked noticeably cheaper, something that people weren't afraid to point out in the reviews. And despite all that, Disney is about to release Ice Age 6 Boiling Point in February 2027. So clearly, the studio never thought this franchise wasn't valuable. It kept making the films. The only thing it stopped making was Blue Sky, or more specifically, it stopped employing the 450 people who created the franchise in the first place. And that's what's most frustrating. Disney just decided that intellectual property was worth keeping while the people behind it were the expensive part. Once you look at it that way, the COVID explanation starts to feel very different. Yes, the pandemic was real, and Disney faced many financial losses, but in reality, the pandemic just gave Disney an excuse to close down a third animation studio it was already struggling with. It was just perfect timing so it wouldn't seem out of place for the studio. Honestly, that makes this whole thing feel like such a missed opportunity. Pixar had established itself as the prestige studio. Disney Animation was built around its own legacy. Blue Sky could have been the smaller, more experimental studio. They'd already been doing exactly that under Fox, with fewer resources and far less support. Instead, Disney folded Blue Sky's library into Disney Plus and barely acknowledged the studio again. But there's one part of Blue Sky they couldn't erase.
This is the part where you run.
Nimona didn't stay dead. In 2022, Annapurna Pictures rescued the project and DNEG Animation finished it. Then, Netflix finally released it in June 2023, and it was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. The movie Disney decided wasn't worth another 10 months of production was finished by another studio. And here's the part that gets me. It wasn't strangers who finished it. Annapurna's animation division was built out of Blue Sky. Both of Blue Sky's co-presidents went there and brought Nimona with them. The directors were the guys who made Spies in Disguise. The producer ran production at Blue Sky. And even Chris Wedge works there now. Disney may have closed the studio, but it couldn't close the people. Before Blue Sky closed, though, its artists left behind one final goodbye. During the studio's last days, a small group of animators secretly made one last short. Even though nobody commissioned it, they simply wanted to finish one final story together. And almost 1 year after Blue Sky closed, they uploaded it as an unlisted YouTube video. It was called The End. For more than 20 years, Scrat chased the same acorn. That was always the joke. He'd get within inches of it, lose it, accidentally trigger another natural disaster, and then start all over again. Looking back, it's hard not to see a little bit of Blue Sky in that story. For 34 years, the studio kept proving itself to people who were never completely convinced it was worth keeping. But in the end, none of that was enough. So the last thing those artists ever animated was Scrat finally getting his happy ending, even if they couldn't get theirs. And honestly, I can't think of a more fitting ending for Blue Sky Studios. Oh, and if you liked that video, then click one of these.